it specifically with marketing mix models, but in this presentation I'm going to get into more detail about some of the assumptions that we make in the model, some of the data that we use, and how we sort of build and calibrate the models. Just as a reminder, we are going to be at the ARF Industry Leaders Forum, so on October 29th. If you want to stop by there and get more information, you can, and you can also contact paul.b@thinkvine.com, and you can set up some time if you want to talk about anything at that forum. So I'm just going to recap a couple of sort of basic, what is agent modeling, and sort of some of the history of it really quickly. In case you missed the first presentation or want to know some background, so we're all sort of starting off on the same footing. But agent-based modeling is really a class of computational models for simulating actions and interactions of autonomous agents with a view of assessing their effects as a whole. So the idea is that you're going to start at the bottom, model the behavior of the agents in the system to sort of give rise to these sort of aggregate results that you see and would typically model. And the Economist article here just deals with, you know, when you have really complex things like the stock market or whatever, they had an article asking questions about whether agent modeling might model the behavior of the traders more accurately than trying to predict the, you know, S&P 500 or whatever from a regression model or an aggregate approach. I'm not going to go through this slide completely. It's sort of a brief history of agent modeling. The main idea here is that it's been around a long time. Since really the 40s and 50s, we started to, you know, think about how this could work. It's been used in a lot of different fields, a lot of use in social sciences, you know, looking at social networks, also things like the weather and hard sciences as well, and traffic flow and things like that. In recent years, it's been applied more to marketing problems, and that's sort of what we're going to go through today is sort of how you can apply that sort of agent modeling framework to answer market category marketing mix questions. Here's a couple of examples of where it's been applied. You know, it's been used to model disease spread. It's been, you know, used to model and explain migratory patterns of animals, supply chain systems, and it's used a lot by the government, military, Santa Fe Institute, and lots of other places to model various things. And the idea is really, like, rather than having, you know, some equation to explain the data that you see, you really start with, in our case, consumers to explain why you see the sales that you see, you know, why people behave in a particular category, you know, as they do, to give rise to those sort of aggregate sales numbers that you see. So this is sort of just an outline of our basic approach. We built the agent population, and what we try to do is make that as representative of whatever population we're modeling as we can, using demographic and media consumption data. A lot of it comes from just census data, so we know the correct distribution of income and gender and all of those sorts of things. And then we also, you know, get media consumption data. So, you know, who watches TV, how much TV do they watch, how much radio do they listen to, how do all those things kind of relate to each other. We generally then get data from the customer to help sort of the category-specific parts of the model. So from the customer, we'll get things like the sales data, any sort of trade promotion data. So if they do, you know, a lot of in-store promotion, like price reductions or displays or things like that, we'll get that sort of data. We also like to know any sort of category behavior. So we'll oftentimes either get maybe some panel facts or something about, you know, a segmentation study they might have done. Basically anything that they know about how consumers behave in the category, we can take that information in and inform our agents to make them more like the population that we're modeling. So a lot of times we'll get segmentation studies, or just we could take results from a discrete choice study or any sort of thing that tells us how people buy and behave in a category, what brands they pick, and that sort of stuff. Once we have all that data and sort of create our population, we then calibrate and build the model and make sure it responds in the way that the real sales respond. And then the last step is, since we really have a software solution, we hand over the product to the end user. So once they have a marketplace that's set up and calibrated, they can then go in and run their own scenarios, create future plans, and simulate what would happen if, they increase TV or change the price or any number of things that we've modeled. They can go in and simulate for themselves. The first thing I'm going to go through is some of the ABM model assumptions, because they're quite a bit different than the typical, OLS regression assumptions anyway. We have built a model on some pretty solid product forecasting principles that have been around for a long time. We use, negative binomial purchasing, and that happens because households have average frequencies that are Gamma distributed, and within households, purchases are Poisson distributed across time. So we use these distributions to help build our agent populations in the right way. The nice thing is you get a lot of things naturally out of having a consumer-based model. So things like penetration curves happen naturally because people who buy frequently buy early and often, and people who buy less buy, much later and maybe not at all in the particular simulation. So you get nice penetration curves that, match what actually happens in the marketplace without having to sort of artificially impose that on the model. It all comes from, agents having differences among themselves and buying differently. Another big point about our model is, advertising impacts can last a long time, and there's been a couple studies by IRI to show this. But basically, what they saw in their panel research was that for marketing, in some cases, you would need to know out as long as 2 years. You could still see a difference between people who were exposed to an ad and those who were not. And in fact, the long-term total effect of marketing is actually much larger than the short-term effect. And typically, in most, ad stock regression models, they're generally pretty short effects. They have 8 to 12-week ad stock maybe, and in our model, we try to measure a much longer effect of media than that. And then, Greg Allenby in Marketing Models of Consumer Heterogeneity also demonstrated the same thing, that, you need a longer-term period to really measure the full effect of marketing, and that the long-term effects are larger than the short-term effects typically. This is just a little illustration of how our model kind of works. So, as the spend ramps up, and the awareness of our consumers increases as they're hit by this media. But it doesn't go away right away. And this is part of how we calibrate the model. But over time, their awareness decreases over time. So we can measure and model a lot longer-term effect. And because each consumer is different, and may or may not watch particular media, this sort of happens in our model naturally just through forgetting. So, as they get hit, their awareness increases, but then they sort of forget over time that they saw the ad, basically. Some more assumptions in our model. Because we have a true time series simulation, our agents change through time. We don't need ad stocking. We naturally get the fact that as time goes by and they're further away from the ad, they are, less aware of your product. And so that makes it an easy framework for longer-term effects. And they do change through time. So the consumers don't react the same way, even when exposed to the same media. So over time, they might, get saturated over time, and then you might go dark for a while, and they might go back down. So we have a true time series view of consumers, so that they change and they're not the same. Another nice thing is interaction naturally occurs at the agent level, so we don't have to assume that the marketing activities are independent. So we know that like certain demographics might watch TV more, and they might, read more print. So those two things aren't independent. If you do TV and print, you're more likely to hit a certain segment of the population. And so those two things kind of saturate together to some extent. So just talking them in two separate lines doesn't really get at the fact that, not everything is independent in here. Some things are actually related based on the demographics of the people that are actually getting hit by these things. And again, since agents are different, not everyone responds the same to media, not everyone buys with the same frequency, so you want to make sure you're getting people that are buying in the category, and maybe that's a particular type of media. And so it's really the heterogeneity of the people and what they view and how they respond, which kind of give rise to all of these aggregate effects that you see. It also allows you to look at subpopulations naturally without the need for separate models or some sort of multi-model approach. Since we have consumers in our model, if you want to break out a particular group like, males 18 to 49 or some other segmentation study that you've done, all of that data is in our model, and we can measure what each person does. So it's very easy for us to break out a particular group of people and look at what happened to them. Again, also media saturates naturally based on the consumption data. So we know what the distribution of TV viewing looks like. And media saturates because some people watch TV a lot and some people don't watch it much at all. So as you hit the people who watch it a lot, it gets harder and harder to hit than the people at the sort of extremes that don't watch TV. So you kind of get this nice saturation without having to build it into the actual inputs or whatever to capture that. The other big thing that we do that's different is we don't have a constant term in our model. So since we don't model with equations at the top, down level, we don't have to assume like in a regression model where there's a constant term so that if you went dark, basically your sales stay flat forever. We don't generally believe that's the case in most of the time. As you go dark, over time your purchases are going to get filtered by other brands in the category, and you're going to start to decline. So we don't need any sort of constant term in our model to explain what happens when marketing goes dark. So just sort of a recap, sort of some of the advantages of having heterogeneity in our agents. Real consumers don't use media the same. They don't experience needs in the category with the same timing. They don't accept risk the same way. They don't have the same price sensitivity. And usually, does it matter? We think yes, it does, because media saturation happens in part because people are different. Heavy viewers see your ad over and over. Light viewers are much harder to reach. Customers have population segments that have commonalities and some differences. And, brand trial builds saturate for the same reason. Frequent buyers buy early, and the rest buy less frequently. And that's why you see those aggregate build curves that come out of a lot of, looking at panels and sales data. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually build the agents. So the first point, which I think is a good one, is that we do generate them from data. It's not magic, or it's not, we don't just come up with them from nowhere. We generally, base it on the data that we have. Census data is used to get all of the demographic distributions for the population. We buy media consumption data, so we know by demographics how people use media. And then category and consumption and consumer data usually comes from the customer, and it helps them buy with the right distribution in the category, shop in the correct channels, have the correct competitive set, have the right targets for the customer, and have the correct relationships to demographics. And one of the nice things about an agent framework is we can take all different kinds of sources of data build that all into sort of our agent generation process and kind of synthesize everything together. So we can take market data from a scanner, we can take, you know, category data from a panel, we can take, you know, demographic data, media consumption data, anything that you know about your consumer or segments, we can build that into the agents and, you know, put all that stuff together so that we build a population that represents the category and has the right kind of things in it to explain the behavior and the things that the customer might be interested in. We also can model market variables. So, you know, we have all of the consumer level stuff. We can also model more like higher level effects. So we model seasonality, and it really affects how agents buy in the category. So what we try to do with these sort of top level effects like seasonality and distribution and price and things like that is handle them in a way where it still is affecting the agent's behavior. So seasonality affects when agents buy in the category. So it's how we sort of sample when they buy. Distribution is pretty easy to handle in our model naturally. If they go to shop and the product's not available, then they can't buy it. So it's like a probability, essentially, that when I go to the store, is the product there. Price changes how, you know, the agents choose. So when they go to the store, depending on how price sensitive they are, they can, you know, buy or not buy, make a selection. They might, you know, would have bought this brand, but because this brand's on sale, then they can buy something else. We can also handle trends like, you know, a basic one is population growth. So, you know, the U.S. population is increasing over time a little bit. So naturally, sales will go up a little bit in the category if the category were sort of keeping the status quo. So we can model trends like population growth in our model. We can also do a number of external factors, and some of these might affect the category or they might affect the way people buy a particular brand, but we can take things into account like, you know, economic factors. So certainly if you're modeling some financial company's sales, the Dow or the S&P 500 or the unemployment rate would have a big effect on how many people might invest in a 401k or something, for example. We can also model the weather, which is a little bit trickier when you're doing future forecasting, but, you know, you can make some assumptions and run different scenarios. But for some things, weather's a big driver. So, you know, it's really hot, you might sell more ice cream, things like that. All of these effects occur at the agent level, and they're not post-model equation adjustments. So we try to, like, make sure that as these things are happening, they're somehow affecting something about the agent themselves and how they buy. And the final piece is the marketing data. So, you know, from the customer, we get all of their past marketing activity and all their sales, of course. And we can incorporate various levels of granularity. We can take in like digital click path data and, you know, monthly magazines. So we can take, you know, all sorts of marketing data in, and we get all of their marketing activities. And we can also incorporate like brand level advertising, item level advertising, and all of that sort of stuff. And the more competitive information we have, the better. So if they have competitive marketing, we can also include all of that and model the competitive brands as well. So I'm going to go through just sort of a day in the life of an agent, sort of just to give you an idea of how this works. So, you know, as a caveat, we only care about behaviors that affect purchase likelihood. So our agents are a little bit boring. They don't do anything fun, but they do respond to media and buy things. So they wake up and then they consume media. So basically, you know, age affects the likelihood of searching, reading, watching TV, using mobile devices. Other things affect it as well. You know, do they have a job? Do they listen to the radio? Do they see billboards on their way to work? How much time do they have available? So free time is a big driver of marketing. And the more are you consuming a lot of media or not? It depends on how much free time you have. Then they decide whether they need the category in that particular week. That's based on their frequency that's correlated to the appropriate things. So, gender might be a factor in how often they need the category and other things. Once they decide they need the category, they have to go shop. They have to pick a channel. And then their final purchase is sort of adjusted by all these things going on. And then they may or may not buy one or none or several brands when they go to the store. And that's sort of how these agents go through time. Every week they do these things, they consume media, they make purchase decisions, and they get changed by their history and all of those things. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about calibrating the marketplace. So we have all this data, we've set up the agents, we have the marketing inputs and all of those things. In general, we like to have at least 2 years of data and a 6-month holdout period for the calibration period. Just a sort of distinction, we calibrate the sales, but we don't really estimate equations to sales, so it's a little bit different. You use sales as a way to check whether your agents are behaving properly, because we want the agents to behave like the observed marketplace. We want the sales and we want the model to react the right way. We generally use something called MAPE, mean absolute percent error, as well as model stability and total yearly error to calibrate. So we start off, the very first run, the model's probably, off quite a bit. You calculate MAPE and yearly error, and it goes through this automated process where it's saying, let me adjust some of these parameters and settings so that as I run the model and auto-calibrate the process, that I get closer and closer to the actual sales from the results of our agent model as it comes out. So once that's done, you can do some fine-tuning, based on residual plots and other diagnostics. But the goal is to get, the predicted sales line as close as possible to the actual sales line and have, small MAPE, small weekly error, and then, the model needs to be stable and have a pretty low yearly error as well. So the behavior of the agents once calibrated is what gives rise to the aggregate sales and the marketing results. And we spit out things like sales by week, marketing impacts, so how much incremental volume came from TV, how much incremental volume came from radio. We sort of break apart short-term and long-term effects. So, what happened within the time frame that you ran it, and what would happen if this stuff could run for as long as it needs to sort of do all the stuff that it needs to do, kind of that long tail of media that we talked about earlier. And we can also measure effects of the marketplace variables. So, if I compare this scenario to that scenario, what did that change in distribution or price do to the sales as well? And then we can also, like I mentioned earlier, get into results by subgroup. So we can talk about different populations and all those sorts of things. And there is some caveat that, the subgroup that you're interested in needs to have a sufficient sample size in the agent population. So it can't be, really, really low incidence groups unless you did some sort of oversampling of them. Once that's done and the model is built, we deploy it to the customer. And we have a web-based platform that, you can use from any browser. And a user can basically run whatever feature scenarios, plans that they want to run using all of the sort of calibrated marketplace variables that we have. So they can change TV, they can change pricing and distribution and all those sorts of things. And we do also continually update and monitor the model. So usually 3 months or so, we'll get a new batch of actual data from the customer, and we'll make sure that, given that the inputs are all what we think they should be, is our line still tracking, what it needs to be? Are we still staying within an acceptable range of error in the future? That's basic overview of how our model is built and all the different pieces of it. Like I said, we're going to be at the ARF forum in a couple weeks, so you can ask more questions there. You can also send me questions and ask questions now. But that's a pretty, broad overview of how our model works, the data that it takes in, and sort of how we build it. So thank you. I guess there's a couple of questions. Do you want me to just answer those, or?
Yeah. Hey, Josh. There's actually a question I sent you from Joshua Opoku. Sorry, might have butchered that, Josh.
Okay. Okay. So the question is, without a model to understand are being affected in the past, how do you determine impact? So we do have the calibration period, which is the last part that I talked about. So basically, we do look at past data to help calibrate future behavior. Generally, we like to have a couple of years worth of data. We make sure that our agents are behaving in a way that makes sense, matches what happens in the marketplace before we sort of turn the loose and allow some. Is someone maybe not on mute, maybe? So, sorry, I'll just repeat that. So, we do use the past data to help calibrate the model. We don't use a logistic model or anything like that. We use calibration data, so we try to get 2 to 3 years of past prior data to calibrate and sort of burn in our agents and get the behavior correct before we sort of do our future simulation results. So are you assigning weights of some sort? So the next question is, by calibration, are you assigning weights of some sort? Basically, we evaluate the different types of marketing and assign sort of how effective they are, essentially. There's lots of other parameters as well, but, we have to adjust, like, for example, the purchase probabilities of the consumers. So maybe we build all these distributions, but when you start running the model, you might be a little bit high or low in the beginning on their category share. So you can adjust that. You might adjust then when they're hit by TV, how much does that affect them? That varies by customer. Not everyone's TV and not every category reacts the same way. So we start off with sort of some general guidelines, but then adjust those sorts of parameters to match the particular marketplace. So I think there was one other question before that I'll answer. It says, is each agent essentially or somewhat a model in itself? Our agents do interact with each other, and I kind of left that out, which I probably shouldn't have, so I apologize for that. But we do have agents and can influence other agents in the system, so they do and can talk to each other. The most common examples of when you might use this would be something like prescription drugs, where you have, a doctor that's a heavy influencer of a consumer that's actually, getting and filling a prescription. So, whether or not a doctor recommends a particular drug to the patient has a huge bearing on whether or not the patient will accept it and fill it or whatever. So that would be one example of, an agent influencing another agent's purchasing decision. You could also model things like word of mouth and stuff like that as well through influencing. So, I saw a really cool YouTube video. I think this product's, really good. I'm going to tell a bunch of people that I know and influence their purchasing. So we can have agents influencing other agents as well. So they're not really independent. Let's see, does one agent the next question is, does one agent correspond to one consumer in the marketplace? It doesn't have to. It depends on what we want to model. We have some flexibility on what we call an agent. It could be a consumer. It could be a household. It could be a group of households. That kind of just depends on how we set up the particular marketplace. It doesn't always correspond to one consumer. In fact, we probably maybe usually build household models, but it just depends. The next question is, how do you determine independence if consumers receive multiple stimuli? Do you mean like an independent, like marketing effects? So the way we measure things like, what did TV do, for example? So a consumer got hit by lots of different things. There's sort of two cases. We try to model like the consumer as it is. So the consumer that's seen everything, that's, been exposed to all this different media, has their particular characteristics, in a sort of world where they didn't see a particular media. So if I want to know what TV did to this particular consumer, I look at that consumer as they are and as they would have been if they hadn't seen TV. And that sort of difference basically tells me, for that particular consumer, what kind of incremental effect that TV advertising has. So the next question is, what types of data go into the model? I talked briefly about it. There's sort of several types. So we get demographic data typically from, the census in the U.S., Census bureaus. So we get all of the demographic distributions from there. We use something called USA Touchpoints to get the media behavior. They did a lot of work on surveying individual people and seeing how they spent their time and what they did in a particular day. We also used lots of things from the customer. Typically, we get sales data, obviously, from either a scanner data or, web sales or however they're capturing it. We also get typically some information about the consumers and their behavior in the category. That varies by customer because we don't require that they buy data or that they have a particular kind of data. We're pretty flexible in that we can still build a model and that we feel good about. But the more data we have, the more rich we can make the sample and more differentiation we can build into the consumers, the more you can get out of it. So at a very basic level, we can build a model where you maybe can't break it apart that well, but the more data that you give us, segmentation data or some panel data about the category, we can start to layer in all of those things and give you more information over time as you change your plan and all that and how it affects the different consumers. The next question, I think, is why would agent-based modeling be a better approach than other types of mixed modeling? Or I may have skipped one. I'll answer that one first. There's several reasons why we like, agent-based modeling and think it's a good approach compared to, a typical regression model. One thing is the constant term that we talked about earlier. People go dark, and we don't believe that, it somehow goes to some flat line forever if that happens. The other problem is we want and believe that you need to sort of model things through time. People aren't the same as they were 2 years ago. All of that history of these agents get built in and change their behavior over time. So we feel like it's a better sort of true time series model. And the other nice thing is we get sort of these, agents that interact with each other, and the marketing effects aren't independent. So, we know how people consume media. We know that sometimes some of these media activities are not independent, that, older people, for example, watch more TV and they read more magazines. If you do both of those things, you're going to be hitting some of the same people. You don't necessarily get that very easily in a typical model. And the agent model is nice because you can build those sorts of things in there naturally because it's very easy to have the media hitting different consumers and they just keep track themselves, like what have I seen. So a lot of the computational things become much easier when you do it at a bottom level rather than trying to fit equations to things. Let's see. So I have another question. Typically, how many variables are included in the model that you are calibrating impact with? That varies wildly by each customer. It depends on how complicated their marketing is and how granular they want to measure. But, some marketplaces might have 30 different marketing activities, and then you've got, price and distribution maybe and a few other things. So in that case, there might be 40 things to worry about. There certainly are models a lot more complicated than that. Some customers might have a couple hundred different marketing activities that they want to measure. I don't think that's that different than what you run in a regression model. I think they ask generally the same types of questions and want to measure the same sorts of things, with the one difference being that we can sort of provide those by different consumer groups. But the overall sort of marketing effects and the things that they're interested in, I would say, are pretty similar across the different modeling techniques, whether you use regression modeling or agent modeling or anything else. All right. So the next question is, how do you deal with needs-based segmentation that doesn't necessarily align neatly into demographic or other categories that tend to give hints on need consumption? I would say there are some limitations on sort of these sort of psychographic type segmentations or something like that. They have to align with something that we measure. So they have to buy more, or they have to align to some sort of demographic or media behavior to have any effect in the system. We can put in any variable that someone wants, assuming that there's some sort of data to generate it. But if it doesn't affect someone's buying or how they consume media, it's going to be pretty much just along for the ride, because those are the two real big drivers in the model. How do people watch media, and how often, and do they buy, and what do they buy? At the end of the day, we're building a purchase model. So if it doesn't affect purchasing, it's not something that we can take into account. So the next question is sort of what categories are you seeing success applying your approach? We've done all sorts of different categories now. I don't know the exact number of models we built. I think maybe 100. I don't know, roughly. We've built models in all different kinds of categories, financial services, CPG. We've had car rental, web products, technology products. I don't think we have, sort of any limitation on, like, the kinds of categories we can model in. As long as, we can get the data and there's some sort of purchasing going on, we've been able to model it pretty well across all kinds of different categories. Let's see, I'm just looking to see if I missed any questions. That's all the questions I see. If I missed somebody, let me know.
All right. Well, Jason, again, thank you so much for your time, and for the rest of the team at ThinkVine for providing all the back-end information to set up this webcast. And I'll be sending your email to all the attendees later on today.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.